There's a lot we can learn from the immigrant experience. A PhD student at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, seeks to understand the bicultural immigrant narrative better. What does happiness mean to these individuals? What can we learn from studies like this? And how does a study like this work? Let's find out on this episode of U Talk.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk about my project today. So my name is Anne. I am a clinical psychology student at UBC Okanagan, and I'm a third-year PhD student and also training to be a clinical psychologist.
What got you interested in psychology? I have a couple of friends, and my partner took psychology when she went to school. So it's always fascinating to learn a little bit about people and why they're interested in the subjects that they are.
I've always been really interested in human behavior, why people do things. So I thought psychology for my undergrad would be the perfect fit for me. And it really was. I really enjoyed my time as an undergrad learning about these foundational things about human behavior. And then I started working with a professor at my university, Mount Royal University in Calgary. And he introduced me to a lot of kind of research methods. So for grad school, I wanted to continue pursuing that, but also I really wanted to be in a field that helped people. And so clinical psychology was kind of the best fit where I could do both research and also help people in the field that I eventually get into.
Well, that's awesome. I think human behavior is also so interesting, like why people do the things they do. And I think it's always great as individuals for ourselves to kind of dissect our own behaviors and understand, okay, why is it that I feel this certain way? What is it about my environment that maybe has molded my behaviors or molded kind of my perception on things? So the field of psychology, it's really, really cool to see individuals like yourself looking at it to better understand, just humanity as a whole.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. Our environment has a lot to do with it, and I think specifically going into the research that I went into, I think culture is a huge part of it, and not just ethnic culture, but also our own cultural identity and how that intersects with other people's cultural identities. So yeah, very interesting stuff.
Yeah. So when you reached out to us, you were interested in talking about your dissertation research project. So before we kind of get into that, what exactly is a dissertation research project? What is kind of the purpose of it for our listeners out there?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I'll try my best to answer it. It's so I'm in a PhD program, and to graduate from my PhD, there are a few milestones to reach. And one of them is basically completing a research project. And so a dissertation would be part of the PhD track, versus if you were in your master's, maybe we would call it like a thesis project. So it's just really a long document of something we're maybe interested in doing or interested in exploring more.
So it's an opportunity for kind of your teachers and professors and things to kind of see the work that you're doing and how you would kind of be within the field once you get there, sort of thing, right?
Yeah. Like at the end of this, hopefully to pass, we would have to do kind of this oral examination where your committee members ask you questions about that dissertation to make sure there's enough information that you understand it. So yeah, that you can kind of proceed into graduation. Which is the goal. Yeah.
Of course, you want to graduate so you can continue to do more projects, continue to dissect the human experience. So this one, bicultural immigrant, I don't think I've ever thought of that or heard that term before. So when you brought it up, I was like, wow, what does that mean? And looking into it a little bit further, I was like, oh, okay, that's what it is. But for a lot of people, this might be something that's like, what does that mean? So please explain it for us. What is a bicultural immigrant?
So there's obviously two components to that phrase, one being bicultural and the other being immigrant. So an immigrant is someone who has maybe the purpose of moving to a different country permanently. And I think one of the common misunderstandings of an immigrant, at least through my own experience is that people believe that immigrants go to another country at their own accord. But that's not always the case, especially for like refugees, asylum seekers. So there's kind of that push and pull factor. What pushes them to leave their country of origin, their home country, which is not always willingly for like security reasons, war, economic reasons.
Well, with the Ukraine-Russian war right now, like the Ukrainian diaspora that's now here in Canada and trying to learn what does it mean to be like a Canadian or like a new Canadian as well.
And yeah, absolutely. Ukraine, Palestine, like all of these different places going through just how can we live in a safe environment, and what pulls them to the country that they are immigrating to. So that's an immigrant. And bicultural is when, in kind of the most simple sense, it's someone who has lived experience of two cultures. So someone could be multicultural, but for someone bicultural, it's usually two cultures that they've have lived experience of and have internalized for themselves.
So that would be someone who has moved here to Canada and embraced Canadian culture while still celebrating and embracing, their heritage and the culture where they were born.
Yeah, like in research, they get really into the specifics of the definition, but I think even someone who considers themselves bicultural could embrace both cultures or could generally just have been exposed long enough to both cultures
Oh,
that they consider
interesting.
themselves, yeah,
Okay.
bicultural.
Why did you want to approach this subject for your research project? I mean, it's incredibly interesting and like we're just barely touching the surface of what it even means here.
In research, there's kind of a couple of reasons why I wanted to do this project. One of them is because immigrants are a really understudied population in psychology, and when we look at it in even further, we understand a lot about sort of the stressors of adjusting to a new culture for immigrants. Like there's so many different factors, and we also know a little bit about the coping mechanisms that they use in that adjustment period during their immigration experience. But what hasn't been explored and what I'm hoping to look at into more is how immigrants see happiness. So in positive psychology research, we know how Westerners understand happiness, what that means to them. We understand how Easterners understand happiness. But what about immigrants who sometimes have Western ideologies and Eastern ideologies? What does happiness mean to them in the context of an immigrant experience? So I really wanted to know that. And having had a lot of conversations with my friends who are newcomer immigrants, first generation immigrants, I am a first generation immigrant myself with my family. So, kind of these own personal experiences and the experiences around me really inspired me to kind of pursue this topic, which I think is really relevant for a lot of people, especially in this day and age.
Oh, definitely. Well, with the audience that we've kind of cultivated and the people we've connected to, we usually cover a lot of the challenges that they're facing. So when you're bringing up this topic of happiness, I think it's just so important to understand, how can we better relate to immigrants and newcomers coming to our country as people who were born here, and how can we better develop society in order to celebrate and ensure that people can achieve that happiness.
That's exactly it. Yeah, kind of building more tools or structure or support for that immigrant experience as they settle into a completely new culture.
What sort of things have you been hearing about in terms of, happiness or maybe even challenges that people go through in their immigrant experience? For the people we talk to and the stories we've covered, a lot of it is the challenge of losing culture. That's a big concern that a lot of the people are having, particularly right now in the Muslim and Arabic community here in Winnipeg. A lot of their kids are like, why would I want to speak Arabic? Why would I go to the mosque and everything? Like, I just want to be a Canadian sort of thing. So there's kind of a little bit of fear that these newer generations might lose a lot of the heritage and culture and knowledge. So I'd just be interested to hear what kind of conversations and things you have been hearing.
That's a really great question, Ryan. And it's so multifaceted. I think through the perspective of the parent, like, why would you want your children to lose like the cultural heritage where you grew up from, the where you came from? But also through the perspective of the children, I think there's a lot of difficulties, especially if you're a child of a first generation immigrant, or if you're someone who had moved at a young age. Adjusting to Canadian culture helps you to fit in with your peers. So I feel like if that's your goal, of course you want to adjust to just Canadian culture. There's this idea of what we call cultural distance. So if, like, for example, if you moved from the UK to Canada, the cultural distance is shorter if you moved from China to Canada. For cultures with a big cultural distance, sometimes those cultures come into conflict, and it can cause almost like this identity crisis. And it's a lot easier, I think, to shift or just internalize one culture a lot more than the other culture, especially if those two cultures are so different from each other. So, yeah, I think I can see a lot of different perspectives around sort of situations like that. But in terms of your question about like the happiness research, I think one thing that always sticks out to me is how the immigrant experience shapes someone's understanding of happiness. There was an article with a participant who, when she was asked about like coping mechanisms, she said that seeing her children succeed was a way of her coping with her like living in Canada as a first generation immigrant.
That was one thing I was thinking is like, yeah, like parents who came here and some of the conversations I've heard from people is like, they're trying really, really hard to create that new life or that new
Mhm.
life for their
Mhm.
kids. And
Or yeah, or kind of like it blends almost with the happiness of the kids. Yeah. Mhm. Absolutely. So it's always like, I think what I've come across so far is every immigrant experience is so unique and so different. So it'll be interesting to see how the this dissertation project goes.
definitely like it's just so vast, so wide, and like I'm just interested what it is, what sort of perspectives, and like you're mentioning like the distances between different cultures can have such a major change for what happiness and what perspectives could look like.
There's so many factors. So I think shedding light a little bit on the project, I'm using quantitative and qualitative methods. So using a survey method, but also interviewing newcomer immigrants. And the reason that I want to use both methods is because I think it really helps to amplify the uniqueness, but also doing it in a way that kind of helps to summarize like what do we know about the immigrant experience and the happiness of immigrants, of newcomer immigrants, and how does that impact or help them cope with their time here?
And those two different ways of achieving that information, like you're mentioning, the survey and the interview might achieve very different sort of answers, sort of thing. When you're talking to someone, potentially maybe they're more reserved and will give different answers versus a survey where they're like, oh, it's online. I can just, say it out through it. Or potentially in those interview processes, you really connect with someone and then they can really, really open up to you on things that they might not even or thought about when filling out a survey.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I'm still very, very early stages of recruitment. But what we're seeing in the interviews is that people can dive deeper into their experiences, whereas the survey gives us better, bigger picture of things. So hopefully that information, they inform each other.
Walk me through what it's going to kind of look like at the end once you gather this information. How is it kind of compiled and put together to make this dissertation?
That's a great question, Ryan. I don't know if I've thought about it that far yet, but it's gonna we're going to use what we know from the survey, collect all of that data, run through it, make sure it's valid responses, etc. And then for the qualitative part, I'm going to transcribe the interviews, work with my committee members to do that, and then looking at both data separately, seeing how they inform each other, and seeing where that common ground is will be.
Well, it sounds really exciting. What is sort of the timeline of creating a project like this? Like, how many hours approximately does it take from kind of conception to be like, yes, this is the idea I want to do,
Mhm.
then collecting all those interviews and then compiling that? What is that ETA sort of thing?
So I think I'm gonna speak from my own experience, and I think it's different for everybody.
Oh,
But
of course.
it took me a year to think of a question and to talk with my supervisor about it and to really refine that question to write out like a proposal, what that looks like, how are we going to go about it? So things like that took about a year and a half before I actually got to go around into recruiting, and then writing it up will take another maybe year or so before I can actually defend it. I think there's a good reason why PhD degrees take 4 years. Like,
Oh,
I really do think
definitely.
it takes the whole time. Yeah.
I think it's important just for people to know about like the process for these, because I know a lot of people who are outside the sciences might be like, why does everything take so long, sort of thing. It's
Yeah.
like, well, it's a lot of work when you're trying to explore these ideas, figure out the proposals,
Mhm.
because like a lot of times it takes funding to do things like this, and you have to be able to sell your idea to funders.
It's a very creative process. It's time consuming, but it's very rewarding. But I think a huge part of why we want to do it right is so that, for example, this dissertation project is so relevant to the general population and the general public. So being able to do this project right will help in the dissemination process after the project is completed, so that I have the right tools, I can say the right things, and tell the public what I learned and hopefully help them governmental policies, healthcare organizations, things like that.
You kind of answered a little bit, but what can we learn from a study like this? What can we all take and apply to our lives when we're looking at what does happiness mean for someone of a bicultural nature?
Oh, that's a good question. I think again, it's twofold. So for immigrants, I can see that when they hear this, the results. So hopefully, my hope is that they can relate to it, that a lot of them can see themselves in it and know that they're not alone in their experiences, that this is very common. And for the general public who may be not bicultural, or they're from here or have lived here a very long time, can empathize with the situation, can empathize that the immigrant experience is so much more than just, oh, moving from one country to another. It's so complex, it's so multifaceted. So I'm hoping that there can be a lot of compassion derived from this study when the results are out.
Yeah, yeah, it's not just, yeah, as you mentioned, not moving from one place to the other. Like, it takes an emotional toll, a
Mhm.
physical toll. For some, it's a spiritual toll, and I mean, it's not even taking into account. One example is a person moved from Canada to Ireland, and their prescriptions weren't covered in Ireland. It's like, well, what do you do in that situation, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like, it's just there are so many different pieces that can apply to it that you might not even think about until it's that sort of situation.
Exactly. I completely agree. Like, there's just so many intricacies to think about.
How can we help? How can people participate in this program?
So there is a survey link out there, and it's a really simple survey to complete. Anybody can take it. It takes maybe 10 to 15 minutes. The fun part of it is that there is a chance to win a gift card at the end of it if you are selected. It's a draw. And if anyone out there who is interested in sharing their experience as a newcomer immigrant, so if you've moved to Canada less than 5 years ago, you can take the survey and indicate that you're interested at the end of the survey.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this project. I really hope it works out and you get the answers that you're looking for, and we can kind of make a difference and change perspectives. I mean, it's going to be a little while till it kind of all wraps up and you've defended it. But you mentioned your goal is to help people. Are there any other projects or things that would be kind of your dream to be a part of?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this. It's always exciting to talk about immigrants and mental health. So, right now, I think I'm still trying to figure out, I guess, as a grad student, what I want to do afterwards. But I think having more emphasis of mental health care on immigrants would be an amazing sort of direction or type of project that I would love to work on in the future, or really just more accessibility of mental health care.
Have any stories you'd like us to share or communities we should highlight? Leave a comment on our social media or reach out to us on our website. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.